name is Frank Aiello. I'm a professor at the law school and also chief of staff to our president and dean. And I just want to let you all know that you've been muted upon entry, most of you. And if I catch any feedback from anybody, I might go ahead and mute you. The way we'll run this today is Professor Cichon will discuss the great work of the Innocence Project, and then we'll have a period for Q&A at the end. And I'd ask that you put those questions in the chat function on WebEx, and I'll be keeping track of those and making sure that we get to everybody's questions when the time is appropriate. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Professor Mitchell-Cichon. She's the director of WMU-Cooley's Innocence Project. The project works to secure the release of factually innocent Michigan prisoners through the use of post-conviction DNA testing. The project's faculty and students have successfully exonerated 3 clients. And in 2006, Professor Mitchell-Cichon received the Justice for All Award from the Criminal Defense Attorneys of Michigan. And in 2014, the WMU-Cooley Innocence Project received the Outstanding Community Contribution Award from the WM-Cooley Student Bar Association. Professor Mitchell-Cichon works closely with the Access to Justice Clinic at our Grand Rapids campus, a clinic she helped to develop. The Access to Justice Clinic assists individuals with the collateral consequences related to their involvement with the criminal justice system and family courts. The clinic focuses on expungements and removal from the Central Registry and Sex Offender Registry. Professor Mitchell-Cichon has extensive practice experience in criminal and poverty law. Her litigation experience includes cases before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, the Ohio Supreme Court, the Michigan Supreme Court, and trial and appellate courts in both Ohio and Michigan. She also works on legislative reform to improve the criminal justice system. Professor Mitchell-Cichon's publications are in the areas of criminal law, elder law, ethics, and clinical teaching. I have the good fortune to work with many amazing faculty here at the law school. But if you can promise to keep it subject to attorney-client privilege, Professor Cichon is one of my favorites. You all likely have experienced those amazing people who can just energize a room, and Professor Mitchell-Cichon also possesses that superpower. So without further ado, Professor Mitchell-Cichon, if you would like to tell us a little bit about the Innocence Project.
Well, yes, thanks for that lovely introduction. We actually have exonerated 4 clients, so that's updated information, and maybe I'll just start with that, and you know, also welcome all of you. I know that the audience might be, you know, your interest in joining this might be because you're thinking about coming to Cooley Law School, which I highly recommend. I've taught at 3 law schools prior to Cooley, and I can promise you that you're going to get a very practical legal education at this law school, and also that we're very committed to the type of work that the Innocence Project program does. And it's critically important now in the midst of this pandemic. Lawyers are needed more than ever. So I really encourage everybody on the call, you know, to get involved in your communities and figure out how you can help. But the clinic was started in 2001, and we came into existence because Michigan passed a post-conviction DNA testing law. But we have expanded our work because we've been very fortunate to get a lot of grant funding, and we also have been very fortunate here in Michigan to have the development of 2 conviction integrity units, one in Wayne County and one in our state attorney general's office. So it's really changing the face of innocence work. And our last exoneration, which was our 4th exoneration, we released Ladura Watkins, who spent multiple years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. And we were successful in his case because we were able to challenge the forensic practices that were used. And in his case, one of the leading pieces of evidence was a comparison of hair collected from a crime scene with hair from 2 suspects. And the forensic analyst actually testified that these hairs were you know, from Ladura Watkins, and there's no scientific basis for saying such a thing. But more recently, the clinic has been working with conviction integrity units, and again, that's really changed what we do, because we're not working in an adversarial system. We're actually working cooperatively with prosecutor's office to get to the truth. So a lot of people ask, you know, are you defense attorneys? No, we're not defense attorneys. You know, are you prosecutors? No, we're not prosecutors. We're just a very unique organization that focuses on factual innocence. And as Professor Aiello said, factual innocence means just that. It means that the individual, in fact, did not commit the crime. So, you know, how can that happen? There's a number of causes that relate to wrongful conviction. And I'm happy to talk about those. And I would really encourage you to put, you know, questions in the chat box. But primarily what my office focuses on is looking at whether or not we can locate evidence that was collected at the time of the original crime, whether that was 1999, whether that was 2014, or whether that was 1972, and whether or not we can then use current scientific methods like DNA testing to identify whether or not the actual perpetrator is on that biological evidence. And so as many of you can imagine, not only do you need to learn about DNA and DNA science, but particularly in older cases, one of our biggest challenges is locating the evidence in the first place. And we have 83 counties in Michigan. And then if you just think about your own local jurisdiction where you live, you might have a township, you might have a city. All of those different agencies could have collected evidence from a crime scene. So our job is tracking that information down. So that's sort of the legal side of our work. And the only other thing that I really want to, you know, mention is just how critically important the students that work in the clinic are. Because we work with 2 conviction integrity units, and both of those units have really developed in the last couple of years, requests for assistance from our office has actually increased significantly. And while I have a staff, it would be impossible for us to screen and identify the cases that we have been able to identify, and the ones that we're working on now, which might lead to, you know, someone's freedom, without the work of the student interns. So the students in my office, they practice law under Michigan Student Practice Rule. They have primary responsibility for these cases in terms of developing investigative strategies, collecting documents, you know, researching, evaluating the case for both innocence and the ability to do forensic retesting or DNA testing. And then ultimately, most of our focus now is, again, working with a conviction integrity unit, which is a lot different than when we started. We had to file a motion in the court system and ask a court to order post-conviction DNA testing. And frankly, when we got started in 2001, the legislators actually thought that there would not be a need for our organization this many years later, because everyone assumed that someone who was charged with a crime would in fact receive post-conviction DNA testing on the front end of the testing, or at the front end of the case. So while DNA testing is being used in front end criminal prosecution, even to this day, sometimes someone who's charged with the crime doesn't get the benefit of DNA testing, or doesn't get the benefit of the very best scientific testing that's available. So what our students learn, because frankly, not many of our students are going to go on to be Innocence Project lawyers. Some of them do aspire to do this work, but what they do learn in this clinic is how to be an excellent lawyer, because these are very complex cases with voluminous documents. They're very difficult and challenging cases, and they require the development of some really important skills. So if you're in the audience and you're thinking about law school, maybe even type into the chat box, what do you think what do you think the traits of a really good lawyer is, right? What kind of skills does a really good lawyer have? And I feel very confident as a very seasoned attorney, and frankly, kind of getting to be an old law professor, that this clinic provides our students with the very best opportunities for developing skills, whether they go on to be prosecuting attorneys, defense attorneys, whether they want to do policy work or criminal justice reform work, or I have had students join my program because they wanted to learn more about DNA, or they were interested in patent law, or they were interested in tort law because they are doing complex litigation and complex legal work here. We are a law office inside a law school, and so we want to make sure that if you have particular interests this evening, that we address them. Or it could be that you all showed up thinking that Ken Wyniemko, who is the star of one of the Netflix programs. So I don't know how many of you are binge watching right now during the quarantine, but I assume that many of you are binge watching. You probably binge watched before, if that's a word. You probably did that before being in quarantine, but now folks are doing a lot more, watching. And it was just coincidental that this series called The Innocence Files came out right around the time that many of us in many states were starting to become quarantined. And I can't begin to tell any of you the depth of the problems or the contributing factors to wrongful conviction. But I can't, in the short time that we have this evening, but I can definitely tell you that in most wrongful conviction cases, more than one thing went wrong. And oftentimes extremely wrong. And so just to kind of set the stage for Ken, Ken was wrongfully convicted of multiple counts of criminal sexual conduct and burglary. And in the Netflix series, his episode, which is the last episode, episode 9, is called The $1 Million Man. And I'm going to let Ken tell you why his episode is called that. But one of the reasons I believe that Ken's case was selected for this series, because keep in mind, folks, we're quickly approaching 300 DNA-related wrongful convictions. So there's literally hundreds of people in our country that have been wrongfully convicted. But there are overlapping themes in these cases, and those themes are factors that tend to contribute to a wrongful conviction. And in Ken's case, many of these factors came into play. So I'm going to list them, and I'm not going to get into any depth with what the specifics are, because Ken can tell you about that. But it just goes to show that one of the things that we look for, even though in my office we're focusing on, hey, was there biological evidence collected that we can test, or was there a forensic practice that perhaps is questionable, that these contributing factors are not related to whether this is a DNA case or not. These are factors that contribute to wrongful convictions, both here in Michigan and throughout our country. And the other thing that's really important for everyone to understand and to think about, I hope you'll all research one aspect of wrongful conviction after this program, is that 90% of these problems are curable. Meaning, if we make changes in our criminal justice system, these problems can, in effect, take away the problem of wrongful conviction. So I'm sure that all of you that are sitting here, I mean, sometimes it's even hard to wrap your head around the fact that we actually, at least a noticeable rate, convict individuals wrongfully in our country. So why is that happening? We have the very best legal system in the entire world. And so one of the reasons is that these factors continue to rear their ugly heads in these cases. So Ken's conviction had many of these factors at play. So one of the contributing factors to wrongful conviction is the inability to have the effective assistance of counsel. So again, if you're in the audience, you're in law school, you're thinking about going to law school, you wonder whether or not this whole law school thing is for you. I mean, we always need good, dedicated lawyers. And unfortunately, because of how our criminal justice system is set up, and in Michigan in particular, we haven't had a rigorous public defender system, ineffective assistance of counsel is a contributing factor. Ken had an attorney appointed to him, or he may have even hired the attorney, and he learned that this attorney had a conflict of interest. The attorney was related to one of the detectives in the case. And when Ken asked the judge to get another attorney, the judge begrudgingly fulfilled his request, but he told Ken on like a Thursday or a Friday, he was not going to move the trial date, which was the following Monday or Tuesday. So even if this was a very dedicated lawyer, right? One who spent the entire weekend on the case, that simply was insufficient time for any lawyer to properly prepare for a criminal sexual conduct case. This was not a case where Ken knew the victim of the crime. So this was not Ken's story versus someone else's story that he knew. This was a stranger rape type of situation. And that was one of the maybe not first things that went wrong. The other thing about Ken's case is that there was what we commonly call in the innocence community snitch testimony, meaning someone who's typically unrelated to the players, but sometimes can be related to the players, comes forward and says something about the crime. And in Ken's case, a man who was in the same jail as Ken when Ken got arrested came forward and said that Ken had admitted the crime to him. What we learned later in Ken's civil trial, meaning after we exonerated him and after he was actually suing the bad actors, is that the police and prosecutor, I'm sorry to report, invited two different inmates to make statements against Ken. One of them refused, and he was identified years later or during the civil litigation. And then there was the gentleman who actually, came into court, raised his right hand to tell the truth, and he testified to information about the crime, which he later said in his civil deposition he learned from the police reports that were put in front of him by the prosecutor and the lead detective. Another contributing factor in Ken's case was the actual biological evidence in the case. It's sort of ironic that Ken was exonerated through post-conviction DNA testing, but unfortunately, prior to his trial, they did analyze some of the items from the rape kit, and they used a technology called serology, which is basically in a rape kit, they're often trying to blood type items. And all the blood types that they found on these items did not match Ken, were inconsistent with Ken's blood type. So he was excluded by the biological evidence. But the wrongdoing we learned later was that there were additional items of evidence that the lead detective advised the lab not to test. And so those items, including the items that were previously tested, were all DNA tested. And after that DNA testing post-conviction, we learned that not only was Ken Wyniemko excluded from each and every item, but that the DNA material that was left behind was actually consistent with one individual. And 5 years after Ken was exonerated, not me personally, the government actually identified who the true perpetrator was. Again, it's really important for people to understand the ripple effect of this, because unfortunately, when that occurred, the statute of limitations to prosecute the actual rapist in this case had run, and he could not be prosecuted. So if we could just step back for a minute and think about this, right? That not only was the wrong man convicted, and he spent almost 9 years in prison until we were able to do this DNA testing, but the actual perpetrator was free during much, if not all of this time, and he went on to perpetrate additional crimes. So those are some of the things that went wrong in Ken's case. And probably one of, I could go on, but I know Ken's going to be joining us soon. But I think one of the focuses of this series, the Innocence Files, is they really wanted to focus on the most egregious wrongdoing cases, right? Where things really went wrong. And unfortunately, in Ken's case, there was intentional misconduct. And certainly there's nothing that we can legislate. There's no policy reform to make a bad guy a good guy. But obviously, one way to correct some of these problems is to have proper identification procedures to hold wrongdoers accountable, and many of the other, again, reforms that I would really encourage you to learn something about. Ken was identified, well, I should back up. The victim of the crime actually during the course of the rape, and by the way, this was this woman was brutally raped. And that is usually the case in a wrongful conviction. There is a true victim. She had a very limited opportunity to view her attacker, but she did make a description of him, and it resulted in a composite drawing, which, by the way, does not look anything like Ken Wyniemko. That said, he became a suspect because an ex-girlfriend of his contacted the police, and that kind of got the ball rolling. So it's another thing for us all to think about. Not that I'm trying to scare people, but frankly, any of us could be part of a wrongful conviction. We know that there's significantly higher rate of wrongful conviction for people of color, but we also know that folks from every walk of life have been wrongfully convicted. There have been white police officers wrongfully convicted in our country. So, wrongful convictions don't necessarily seek out a certain type of person, but we know based on our criminal justice system, generally, people who have resources, who can hire the best lawyer, are less likely to be wrongfully convicted. We know that if someone has more time to prepare for a trial, or if a proper lineup procedure is used, or if snitch testimony is scrutinized before it ever gets before the jury. In Illinois, they actually have a statute that requires now a pretrial hearing anytime an incentivized witness is going to testify in a criminal case. So those are some of the policy changes that can be made, but we also know that we can't change bad actors, and we, someone who's out to get someone or doesn't, work by the book or play by the book. That's tough behavior to address. But we also know that oftentimes bad actors in the criminal justice system, prosecutors, police officers, and others are not held accountable. Many of you may already know, but for the most part, prosecutors, they have qualified immunity, and anything that they do essentially in the courtroom is protected. So it's very hard sometimes legally to hold these actors accountable, but it also illustrates that whether you're going to be an Innocence Project lawyer or not, or a criminal lawyer, civil litigation does come out of these wrongful convictions, and it costs us, the taxpayers, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's in everyone's best interest as citizens to have bad actors, particularly bad actors that consistently act bad and do so intentionally. It's in our best interest to have them held accountable.
Professor, there was a question in the chat related, and that was, were the prosecutors ever disciplined by the state bar?
In this particular case, and in most cases, the answer is no. The detective was not, the detective was held responsible financially in the civil litigation. The prosecutor received immunity, and the prosecutor went on to become a judge. And again, we see this as a commonplace thing, that bad actors are not held accountable.
As we await Ken, Professor Cichon, I'm wondering if you could talk about, and outside of just all the great work that the Innocence Project is doing and Cooley housing the Innocence Project, how does the Innocence Project advance Cooley's legal education program, or how does it fit in?
Well, I think it's the quintessential, practical legal scholarship. And again, I've taught at other law schools, so I can very confidently say that at Cooley, we try to teach you how to really be a lawyer. So, everyone's heard the catchphrase, think like a lawyer. But when you're in our clinics or you're doing hands-on work with even a private attorney, right? You're sitting in on a client interview, or in our case, when you go to the jail or the prison, right? And you're hearing this innocent person's story, you're doing hands-on, legal work. And again, our mission in the Innocence Project, and it's really true for all of our clinics, is that we have the students take the lead as much as is ethically possible and reasonable given their training.
We've got a few students who were summer starts who are joining us just to kind of learn a little bit more about the school. So we welcome you guys and look forward to seeing you in the fall. One of the questions was, or comments, I'm eager to hear about what Cooley has to offer in terms of programs, as well as keep my mind focused on law-related subjects. Another question, is there any kind of specific work being done to challenge the immunity of these bad actors?
That's a tough, I appreciate the question, but first of all, I'm not a civil litigator, so I'm not an expert on this, but these are very, having qualified or even absolute immunity without looking at the context makes sense. A judge should not be held legally responsible because he or she makes a bad decision, right? Because we want to encourage good lawyers to become judges, right? And we don't want the fear of punishment by taking on more responsibility as a professional as a deterrent. And that's why judges, for example, have absolute immunity. For prosecutors have absolute immunity for what they, the easiest way to say it is for what they do in court, right? But they can cross that line and they can lose their shield of immunity if they are engaging in what's called an investigative function. So I will use Ladura Watkins' case for that example. So Mr. Watkins, who I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the prosecutor, one of the prosecutors involved in his case worked directly with an incentivized witness, and interviewed him and played very much an investigative role in having this incentivized witness essentially throw Mr. Watkins under the bus and blame the murder on him. That case is actually in litigation now. And one of the arguments that the civil attorney is making is that he's not protected by qualified immunity because what he did was investigative and it wasn't in the course of the litigation per se. So maybe my final comment on this would be, again, come to law school, right? Because the way you change the law, so if you don't like qualified immunity, then come to law school and maybe try to get things changed. But also, there's, being a lawyer, you can actually be pretty creative. And even if the law is constraining, you don't like the law, it feels like you can't hold somebody accountable that you want to, then you go to the legislature. And that's what I do now, right? Like I never wanted to work with the legislature as a young lawyer. And I'm actually still pretty bad at working with the legislature, right? But I felt on some of these issues, the laws simply have to be changed. And the work that we do in the Innocence Project, we're seeing these problems firsthand, and we know what we're talking about. And our own clients, Ken Wyniemko and Ladura Watkins, have both testified in front of the Michigan legislature for things like compensation for those who have been wrongfully convicted. So there's lots of ways to use your law degree. If you don't like the way the law is written, well, you can try to get it changed through the legislature. You can make creative arguments. You can argue for exceptions. You can really make a difference in the legal profession for sure.
I have a question about compensation, Professor Mitchell, if you wanted to answer that now. If not, we can do later.
I'll just say quickly that it's a really tough area. We worked for about 12 years to try to get a compensation law passed here in Michigan. I actually was involved many of those years, and compensation laws vary from state to state. And our current compensation law provides $50,000 per year of wrongful conviction, but it also places a very heavy burden on the exonerated individual to prove their innocence in effect again. And in my view, as an Innocence Project lawyer, the standards need to be adjusted and changed to make it easier for those who have been wrongfully convicted to be compensated.
Professor O'Leary, could I pick on you for a minute?
Sorry. I said
No worries.
absolutely, but my mic thing was up here.
I'm wondering if you could, I know you're both formerly a clinical professor and now you're in the classroom, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the ethos of Cooley and its grounding in practical legal education and how that plays itself out even in our traditional, classes.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I was sitting here thinking is that Professor Mitchell-Cichon probably, I got in a few minutes after she started, but she probably didn't talk about how unbelievably experienced and talented she is as a clinical professor. She's known throughout the country as somebody who follows all of the best practices of clinical teaching. And in fact, Cooley has had a really strong clinical program for many, many years. When I first came, I was involved in for almost 30 years of my career teaching in clinics. And we follow all of our clinical programs are built on students being at the center of the performance, learning how to do what they're doing, getting a chance to do it, and then getting individual feedback from faculty, and so that when they graduate, they already have one foot into practice. So that's just kind of the start, and we have several terrific clinics, but the Innocence Project is certainly one of the highlights of our program. I used to be the director of the 60 Plus clinic, and about 3 years ago, I went into the first year program. So I teach contracts and property now, and one of my goals was to bring some of those clinical tools into the first year program so that students are actually, and a lot of professors are doing this now. We have a very robust academic support program, and a lot of us work with them very closely. But our goal is to help you understand how all of these pieces work so that you can be successful doing it. And it's hard. One of the things we hold people accountable for every student for getting the work done. But when you finish one of our courses, you understand the material. That's the goal. And so we've brought a lot of those active learning techniques into the classroom, whether it's online or whether it's in person. We've brought a lot of the feedback aspects that we are very strict about in the clinic into the first year classroom so that students know exactly what they need to work on for improvement. And my premise, and I think this is true for most of us, we believe you're coming to law school because you want to be a lawyer, because you want to be a good lawyer, and because you're interested. And so that's where we start. And because we love what we do, and we think you can love what you're doing. So I would say banish all of those I hate law school, kind of ideas, and think more of we're in this enterprise together and in it for exploration. And I also think at Cooley, we have the benefit of having students who come to us from really different backgrounds, professional backgrounds, different cultures, different geographies. And so, the law is something human people create, and your perspectives are vitally important in how we understand what the law is and what the law should be from the very first week of law school. So, I know some of you are already here, Cooley, and I recognize you, and it's nice to see some of your faces. And hi, Mandy. She's waving to me. But and some of you are newer, and we will get to know you if you, when you come. So, I mean, one of the things I feel like the Innocence Project is a very stark example of injustice and work around trying to remedy that. But there's all kinds of ways that our system needs to be improved, both in the civil field and the criminal field. And we're looking to graduate lawyers who have an interest in continuous improvement of the legal system. So we certainly welcome that impulse that you hopefully are bringing with you.
Professor Mitchell-Cichon, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the WMU-Cooley Innocence Project fits into sort of the broader movement and organization.
Yes, thank you. So when we started in 2001, we actually obtained the trademark Innocence Project, which it's a huge honor for us to have that trademark because the first Innocence Project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was started by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, who, by the way, are co-producers of the Innocence Files, and they also appear in the Innocence Files in various episodes. So we got the trademark, and keep in mind that even the Innocence Project in New York was primarily focusing on obtaining post-conviction DNA testing to prove innocence. So we were modeled after the work that they did. Now there's virtually innocence. I think there's an Innocence Project in every state. There are actually Innocence Projects all around the world. And in some states, there's more than one Innocence Project. Not all of them carry the trademark, but we all belong to an organization called the Innocence Network. And we obviously, I don't know exactly where that question's coming from, but having those resources throughout the country really helps inform our work. because these are very tough cases. And if we are going to make changes to the system, whether it's changing things legislatively or whether it's asking courts to no longer consider bite mark a science, since it's not, then, obviously we have the resources of other organizations and we work very closely with them. I think they'll text me when they get him on. Hopefully it'll work. He's getting IT help from Lori Montgomery. I'll just give her a shout out. And also just kind of put in a plug, for like the opportunities that the Cooley Innocence Project has provided to my students. So Lori was a very top student at Cooley. She became the LLM fellow. We have a fellowship program with the Innocence Project, which allows our postgraduate students to continue to participate and train as a future lawyer, but also take on some more responsibilities. And Lori, I would say without a doubt, is probably the most knowledgeable post-conviction DNA lawyer in our state, which means that, of course, someone stole her away from my office. So she is now the DNA attorney for the Conviction Integrity Unit at the Attorney General's office. So that's kind of a career trajectory. And it's bittersweet for me personally, because Lori is was a very contributing member of our firm, but it's just really interesting to think about the fact that someone who has done Innocence Project work now for about 3 years, she's still a young lawyer, but 3 years of Innocence Project work, and now she is actually working for a Conviction Integrity Unit. So she has the exposure to all of the issues that I've been talking about tonight, as well as the DNA knowledge. And she is going to be assisting the Attorney General's office in working with us and deciding what cases are appropriate for post-conviction DNA testing. And that's really in sharp contrast to when we started in 2001. No one had even heard of post-conviction DNA testing, and judges had not seen these types of motions ever in this state. So when we would go into court, oftentimes the prosecutor and the judge wouldn't know exactly what to do with all of this, right? Again, Professor O'Leary used to always say, as my close colleague and friend, she didn't understand why, if you were asking to DNA test biological evidence, why a judge or a prosecutor just wouldn't go along with it. And in fairness to prosecutors and judges, some of it was just this new law and folks were not comfortable with it. And I'm very proud of the work. I think one of the things I'm most proud of in my own career and of my students is that we also were very instrumental in litigating a few cases before the Court of Appeals of Michigan and the Michigan Supreme Court, which ultimately were favorable not only to our client, but which resulted in an interpretation of the post-conviction DNA statute that was favorable for our future clients. And students, in many cases, wrote those briefs, and in one case, argued in front of the Court of Appeals. So going back to the earlier question about practical legal education, if you can imagine being a third-year law student and you're going to be arguing in front of the Michigan Court of Appeals, there's lawyers in Michigan that have never done that. And just one little icing on that cake is that we, of course, would prepare, right? You guys have all heard the word moot, doing a moot argument. And so the intern obviously was very familiar with the case and she was very prepared. But something happened that we didn't expect. And that's another thing that's really fun or not so fun about being a lawyer is, best laid plans and then somebody throws a wrench in them. So on a Thursday or a Friday, we got what I'll call a candygram from the Court of Appeals. And the good news was they told me in this court notification that our request for the student to argue the case was approved, which was really amazing because we were prepping, right? We were moot we were mooting the arguments. So that was the good news. The bad news was the court itself raised 5 issues that were not briefed, and they all related to procedural law, which I won't bore you with what that is. And they basically said, and so be prepared to answer these 5 questions. And we were like 3 to 5 days out from the oral argument. So,
and then they'll unmute you when they're ready.
I think I can see Marla. Hit.
You're in. They can hear you.
Hit. Should I hit?
Nope, you're good.
You're good. You're in, Ken. Thank you, Lori Montgomery. I did a sweet shout out to you because you're such an amazing friend and such a great lawyer. And let me just finish my thought, Ken, and then I'll introduce you. Okay. So all I was sharing with everyone else, Ken, was just some of the, some of the litigation that we've done over the years to get good court decisions about the DNA law and how important the students have been in that process. And I was telling them a story about a student finding out 5 days before an oral argument that she had to let the Court of Appeals, she had to give information to the Court of Appeals on 5 issues that we were not prepared. So I just can't help myself by finishing the story by saying one of the issues that they brought up was they said, we want you to come into court in, again, it was short, like maybe 3-4 days. And we want you to address this issue. And it's called how the law of the case doctrine. So the student looks at me and she goes, what is that? And I said, I have absolutely no idea. And of course, I had like 25 years of experience. So another reason to be a lawyer is because you're never bored. And so with that, Ken, I see you're in your office, and I see you have some strong memorabilia behind you, but everyone has been waiting for you. And I feel like I've kind of been like, the warm-up act here, like, like the up and coming comedian, and you're like the star.
I'm not I love the Beatles, but I'm not the Beatles. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. But anyway, Ken, just to give you a little bit of a context, we've got a wide audience here this evening. Some folks who are current law students, some who are my colleagues, my friends, some are aspiring law students, and maybe a few more folks out there. But everyone is really interested. I've already shared with them about the Netflix series. And I think if I could just kick it off, I know everybody's been dying to know why is your episode called The $1 Million Man?
Well, that's a good question, and I love telling the answer. When I was first arrested on June 14th, I was placed on a lineup and I was released because I was told nobody could identify me. And then I was rearrested the following day. And well, let me back up. After I was released, I had to call my dad to come and pick me up from the county jail. My dad was still alive at the time. He was 76 years old and he was a diabetic, World War II Navy veteran. And came to pick me up and he asked me what had happened. And I explained to him, I don't know what the hell the cops are doing. I don't know what they're talking about. So came back, he drove me back to my house because by this point I was sitting in the county jail for 4 or 5 hours. I could just feel my skin crawl. And I pulled in my dad pulled in my driveway and there was an unmarked police car sitting parked in front of my home. So my dad and I got out of his car and I started to walk up on the porch to go inside, and the cop that was inside the unmarked car came up to me, and as it turned out, that cop turned out to be Lieutenant Al Ernst, who was in charge of the entire investigation. Okay. And he said, Wyniemko, where do you think you're going? I said, I'm going inside my home to take a shower. I feel filthy. I've been sitting in that cell for 5 hours. My skin was crawling. He said, I'm sorry, you can't go inside your house because he was waiting for a search warrant. And I said, I've done nothing wrong. I own this house. You're more than welcome to come inside with me. I have nothing to hide, but I want to take a shower. And I went to put my key in the door and he pulled his pistol out He put it right next to my head. He said, "Wyniemko, step away from the door." And when that happened, my dad, who I said was 76 years old and a diabetic, he started shaking real bad. He was crying. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. So at that point, my main concern was my dad's health. So I told my dad, I said, "Come on, Dad, let's go back." You know, got back in his car, and I drove over to my mom and dad's house, and I took a shower over there, and my mom made some soup and sandwiches for my dad and I. And my dad, about 3 hours later, returned back to my house, and I pulled in the driveway, and all the lights were on in the house. The doors are wide open, and my dad and I walked inside, and it looked like a fucking tornado had gone. Pardon my French, but I'm going to tell it like it is, okay? Like a tornado went through. And my dad started crying again. I thought I was going to have to take him to the hospital. So I said, "Dad, just go home, try to relax, and I'll put the house back together." And that's what I did. I stayed up most of the night. I put the house back together as best I could. I got up the next morning. I had to go to the bank. I went to open up the bowling alley, and I had to stop at Myers because when the cops went through my house, they were so arrogant. They went into my refrigerator and they took out jars of pickles and peppers and olives, and they broke all the glass jars on the living room floor, on my kitchen floor. So I had to stop at Myers after I opened the bowling center. I went to the bank and I came back home, and I pulled in my driveway, and the two lead detectives, Ostin and Marlette. And by the way, ever since this happened, I don't refer to them as detectives anymore. Detective Ostin. I refer to them as defective Ostin. Not detectives, defectives, okay? So I got out of my car. I was holding one bag of groceries in my left arm, and Ostin got out of the car, and he said, "Why don't you go drop that bag and put your hands on the roof of your car?" And I said, "You want to tell me what's wrong now?" I said, what do you think I've done now? I haven't done anything wrong." And during that conversation, 4 marked Clinton Township police cars, they came on the scene. 2 pulled up on my lawn, 2 pulled up on my neighbor's lawn. 8 uniformed officers got out of their cars. So when the last officer got out of the car, Ostin told me again, he says, "Wyniemko, I'm going to tell you for the last time, drop that bag and put your hands on the roof of the car." And when he said it the second time, all the cops pulled their guns, and 2 of them had sawed-off shotguns. So I had 8 guns that aimed at me. I seriously thought they were going to kill me. So I put my bag in the driveway. I put my hands on the roof of my car. Ostin handcuffed me behind my back, and he told me that I'm under arrest for this BE armed robbery and rape because I was identified in a lineup the day before. And I told him, I said, "Look, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I'm not stupid." And back then I didn't know that much about the law, but I know criminal law very well now. I studied it every day for 10 years when I was locked up. So I know what I'm talking about when it comes to criminal law. And I said, "I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I'm not stupid. And if someone would have identified me in that lineup, you guys would have never let me leave the jail. You would have arrested me right on the spot. It's just common sense." And he said, "You know what, Wyniemko?" He says, "I'm going to start calling you the $1 Million Man." And I looked at him. I said, "You want to tell me what that's supposed to mean?" And his exact words were, he said, "Wyniemko, by the time I get done fucking with you, it's going to cost you $1 million to get your ass out of prison," quote unquote. And this cop was so arrogant, he even admitted saying that during his deposition for my civil suit because I sued the Clinton Township Police and the city of Clinton Township. So when the producers from Netflix, when they chose that name for the title of that episode, it was perfect. I couldn't have picked a better title myself. So that's how that name came about.
So Ken, before you came on the call, we kind of quickly ran through the contributing factors in your case, right?
Okay.
Ineffective assistance of counsel, the lack of time that your attorney had, the snitch testimony, the identification procedures used, and obviously a theme in your case is the misconduct. And Earlier, folks were asking, I'd really love to hear the answer from your perspective, you know, if you, because you're a very involved criminal justice advocate, what do you think is the most important criminal justice reform needed? And I know that there's many things needed, but on your top list, what is it, Ken?
Well, there are several things that need to be taken care of, and I'll fight to the day that I die to make sure that they're implemented. One, and I'm starting a big push for this now, and I'll get into this a little bit later on. This whole issue of immunity, police immunity, prosecutorial immunity, judicial immunity, that has to go. That has to go. Because if you look at my case as an example, okay, and this is the truth, kids, think about it. If you look at everyone involved in my case, from the prosecutor, and we proved this in federal court, okay, and Judge Zatkoff wrote a 51-page opinion and order agreeing with us. If you look at all the players in my case, from the prosecutor to the 3 detectives who hid the evidence, to the jailhouse snitch who lied, to the and was coerced into lying. My ex-girlfriend was coerced to lying. Okay, the actions of the judge, the incompetence of the court-appointed attorney Albert Markowski, who only had Saturday and Sunday to prepare for a capital offensive case. Look at all those people and myself. The only person who didn't commit a crime was me. And I get sentenced to 40 to 60 years. Everybody else gets promoted. Now, what kind of bullshit is that? And that has to stop. And I believe in my heart, Marla, the only way these wrongful convictions are going to stop is if you have to get rid of that immunity issue. If you find someone like Linda Davis or Defective Ostin who hid evidence, and Judge Zatkoff, in his opinion, accused them of conspiracy to obstruct justice, withholding evidence, suborning perjury. Those are mortal sins in a criminal justice system. I don't have to tell any of you that, okay? So if you indict or arrest and convict 1 or 2 prosecutors and detectives, the rest of the prosecutors out there are going to get the message just like that. I guarantee you, because they don't have the guts to go to prison like I did or my fellow exonerees around the country. Okay, that has to be number 1 on my list. Okay, the lineup procedures are we know they're all too defective. They have to be reformed. Snitch testimony should be completely banned, in my opinion. These people are paid liars. And when I was doing, I did an interview last week with Mike Morris and Carl Marlinga and myself and Kevin Dees from Channel 4. I found out through the 7, and believe it, Marla, can you believe next month it was going to be 17 years I've been home? I can't believe it. But anyhow, if you look at all these snitches, these people are paid professional liars. And if you study the cases around the country like I do, these snitches, they're not used just one time. They're used 4 to 5 times. The police use the same people because the snitches are too stupid to realize, and the prosecutors are probably too cocky to understand that one day they're going to get caught, like I caught him, my fellow exonerees caught him. The prosecutors and the police know that if they get a snitch, like in my case, convince him to lie, 5 months later, he's going to commit another crime. They're going to get arrested again, so he's not going anywhere. Okay, you understand what I'm saying, everybody? It's just it's common sense, and when I say common sense, it always reminds me of my dear friend Mitch Album, who I've become good friends since I've been home. I don't know how many times I've done his radio show, but he made one point very clear. He said, "Kenny, common sense has become too uncommon." And when he said that, he hit the nail right on the head. Believe me. So those are some of the main issues that I'm pushing for. But that immunity really is a thorn in my ass, and I'm gonna pull it out of there and try to get things working the right way. Fair for everyone.
So Ken, we're getting some questions that I want to move on to, but before we leave that topic, I just want to be clear for maybe those that aren't like doing the work. There have been some states now that have actually filed criminal charges against detectives or investigators, and in Texas they actually filed charges against prosecutors, criminal charges, for intentional misconduct. But again, we have a long way to go, because even though there were those laws on the books, and some of these individuals were actually found guilty, their punishment was very minimal. In other words, then the judges gave them more slaps on the wrist than punishment. So, and I'm glad you talked about the immunity issue too, Ken, because that was a question earlier. But if it's okay with you, I'd like to switch gears to a few of the other questions.
I'm all ears.
Okay, so my angel of the evening, Lori Montgomery, is asking a question that actually I was going to pose to you. So good minds think alike. And I ask you this question a lot too, Ken, but it's always good to ask this question of you over and over when we have new folks in the room. And it goes to, what is the most important thing that new lawyers, young lawyers, what do they need to know or do as they're entering the legal profession, whether it's to do this type of work or criminal work? What's the most important attribute or skill that an attorney needs to develop?
That's a great question, and I love answering it to new law students. Marla, how long I've been doing this. I enjoy this so much because I want to tell the new students, let them know what is coming down the road. Okay. My first suggestion would be, understand first of all that someone's life could be in your hands. Okay. Could be a life term in prison. Could be some state in a death penalty that has a death penalty. But understand that. Take the time to listen to your client. Don't assume anything, or don't assume everything that the prosecutor or police tell you is the truth, because many times it is not. I'm living proof of that. I've got about 2,500 my fellow exonerees around the country that will back me up on that. Okay. Take the time, look at the facts. If something is bothering you, something doesn't seem right, step back, take a step back, take a second look. Very important. Take the blinders off. Police and prosecutors are very well known for having the blinders on and rushing to judgment, and they think, hey, we have the right guy, and I'll use this as a perfect example because I just got done watching CNN. Look at Donald Trump. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a case called the Central Park Five. Are you familiar with the case where five Hispanic or Black Americans were accused of beating and raping a white woman in New York City? They kept on asking for DNA testing. Finally, it was granted. They were all proven innocent. It came back to one person. Okay, and I've got a copy of the front page New York Times. Donald Trump's on there, and he's saying, I don't care what the DNA says. I know these people are guilty. They have to be guilty. Okay. So it's stupidity like that, or just plain ignorance. Okay. I don't care what party you belong to, but I call a spade a spade. A fact is a fact. Okay. So don't assume that what the police or prosecutor tell you is the honest truth. It's going to I'm sure it's going to take time for you to get used to that. But I hope that each of you can appreciate the chance to speak to an exoneree who's been through the mill. And I talk the talk because I walk the walk. My record proves that ever since I've been home. And you know, if you always keep that in the back of your mind, you'll be very successful, and God willing, you'll make the better place to live, and more importantly, help reform our criminal justice system, because it really is fucked up. And pardon my French, but I'm telling you like it is.
We don't have any beeping tools to beep you. But just to follow up on what Ken is saying, again, I think regardless of what area of practice, or whether you're a prosecutor or a defense attorney, it's critically important as a lawyer that every client's story, every client's situation is unique and important. And it needs to be, it's clearly important to them, but it needs to be important to you. And I think, even well-intentioned lawyers sometimes can get in this thinking of, oh yeah, I heard that before. And, just to echo what Ken's saying, in my work in the Innocence Project, and I know Ken probably felt this way through his case, I can't tell you how many clients have said to me, you are the first person, you're the first attorney that has really listened to me and really wants to hear my story. And that's that's sort of a sad commentary of lawyers. But, as we become more experienced, we have to be careful that we don't get lazy or complacent, and that we always keep our skills sharp by meeting each client where the client is and being open to listening to their story, because Ken's story is crazy, guys. Right, Ken? Like,
it's so many people have told me it's unbelievable. It's almost too unbelievable to believe. And to this day, I was talking to Barry Scheck about 3 days ago. To this day, he still believes that my case is one of the 5 worst cases ever in the country. Okay. And there are a lot of well-known attorneys, well-respected attorneys that I've been dealing with agree with that. I mean, you just can't make up a story of the facts that would happen to me. It's too unbelievable to believe. And all the 5 leading causes of wrongful convictions, I mean, I've got all of the above in mind, and so please, and Marla, I wanted to just back up. I thought of something that Marla said about listening to the attorneys. I can remember after I was denied through the appellate courts and state Supreme Court, and I was just about out of options. And I wrote to. I'm a stubborn Pole. Like, if I know I'm right, I'm gonna fight to the day I die. Okay, and I wrote to every major newspaper reporter in the Tri-County area. I put together, a packet of the facts, because I wasn't getting all the police reports or court transcripts all at once. I was getting them in bits and pieces. So it took me some time to put everything together. And as I said, I was in a law library 7 days a week. Okay. And I wrote to shows like 60 Minutes, Dateline, 2020. And I wrote to Barry Scheck. A friend of mine told me about Barry Scheck, and this was during the time of the O.J. Simpson trial. So I wrote to about 4 or 5 months after I write to Barry. Barry writes me. Oh, and I write to Barry. Okay, Barry writes me back about 4 or 5 months after I'd written him, and he told me that, and I still have the letter. I have the letter in my office on the wall. He says, Kenny, this case sounds fucked up, and he wants to help, but the problem is he has a backlog of over 4,000 requests in front of me, so he doesn't know if or when he could, come to my aid. That was the bad news. But the good news was that they were in the process of opening up an Innocence Project at Cooley in Lansing, and he was going to refer my case to them. And thank God he did. That's why I'm sitting here right now. So when after I remember it was so funny. Everything happened so quick, like within a week. I get a letter from Kim Norris-Shine, who was a reporter from the Detroit Free Press. She writes me a letter, she's the daughter of Neil Shine, one of the most respected newspaper publishers in the country. And she wrote a letter to me. She wanted to know if she could come and talk to me in person. I said, sure, if you get clearance from the Department of Corrections, I'd love to meet you. And then I got a letter from, I think, Kathy Swedlow, who was then the co-director of Cooley, another one of my angels, okay? And they came to Kathy, and they got a hold of Gail Pamikoff, who got involved in my case on pro bono basis. Gail is the epitome of what an attorney should be, I believe. And to this day, she's still my personal attorney. I love her to death. And they came to see me. And I remember when everybody left, after being turned down in every court that I went to, I could finally see. I was so happy that I got somebody to sit down face to face with and talk to. Somebody actually listened to me. I can't tell you how much that meant to me and picked my spirits up. And that when I went back to my cell, it dawned on me, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that light wasn't a freight train. It was the light to freedom. And I'll be forever grateful in debt to those wonderful women who helped me get my freedom. And the whole work of the Innocence Project. I'm Innocence Project through and through, baby. And I'm never going to stop swinging. Never.
And we could never figure that out by your backdrop either. So I'm glad you could be so direct about that.
I want to get the word out. That's all I do. If I can only inform one person today knows that didn't know about it yesterday about the project, it's a better world.
So another question that we had, Ken, was share your thoughts about why it might be so difficult to effectively train police officers. So as opposed to individual bad actors, I mean, the Innocence Project work is over 20 years old now, right? Yep. We're getting close to 25 years of doing this work, yet sometimes these problems continue. What ideas or suggestions do you have for effectively training police officers? And I'm just going to friendly amendment the question. And, up and coming lawyers, both defense lawyers and prosecutors, so that we can be better trained and, serve the clients and serve the public better.
Well, that's another good question, Marla. First, I'd answer it this way. The cops and the prosecutors, their instructors need to listen and learn too. They need to learn from all the 2,500 exonerations around the country. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves, okay? I don't know if you remember or not, Marla, back in, we were at our national convention, but we were in Cincinnati 5 or 6 years ago, maybe not that long, but I remember I was signing my books right next to the table with Kirk Bloodsworth. He was taking ring sizes for all the exonerees. I don't know if you remember that. But I sat in a meeting from the project in Illinois, and there was a state rep there from Illinois where they're actually teaching their state police officers about the work that the Innocence Project does, which is a great idea. That, to me, that should be mandatory training in every state. That's like it'd be like someone living on a lake and not teaching your kids how to swim. It's just common sense. But we're making progress, not as quickly as I would like. We're making progress. There's no doubt about that. The numbers speak for themselves again. And I believe if you get, if that immunity issue is removed, that'll open some eyes up to, it probably clicked in somebody's head. Hey, maybe we better start rethinking our training exercises. And let me say this: number one thing that needs to be done, because I did this 3 times a day. We all need to pray. Pray that everybody is honest enough and to bring the truth out to light. If that happens, there's nothing more powerful than prayer, kids. Trust me.
So Ken, I want to kind of piggyback on that a little bit. We're actually kind of running to the end of our time, so I want to give you a chance to, you know, to say the last rah here. But on this point of training either police officers or future lawyers, you know, I think it's very easy for all of us as individual people to sometimes not relate to people that, you know, we don't know anything about. And I really like your idea, and I'm very intrigued by this idea of, you know, how powerful it is to meet someone who's been wrongfully convicted. I mean, even though we're all online tonight, like you always bring the same passion, commitment, and emotion. And, you know, maybe I can just also use this opportunity to thank you, you know, for being such an advocate, because I know sometimes going out in the world and telling your story is challenging. But I wonder if you have a quick thought about, you know, to me, one of the most effective tools in training people is to meet people, right? It's very difficult to meet you and then just walk away and say, oh, well, okay, I guess that's somebody else's problem, right? So you mentioned Kurt Bloodsworth, who is, by the way, everyone, the first death row inmate who was exonerated by DNA. He is also a very dedicated criminal justice advocate, but training by having exonerees who are comfortable and willing, you know, training and meeting young attorneys, meeting prosecutors, helping to train police officers by simply telling their story, right? And that's what you did in your book.
Yeah, and you know, it's unfortunate. I'm one of the fortunate exonerees that have the ability to get my point across. Some of the exonerees, and I know most of them across the country, you know, they have low IQs, or some of them don't want to be bothered. They're just happy to be free, you know. And I'm not ashamed to tell you this myself. When I first started, right after I got out, I first started, you know, I was all over the country speaking at different law schools. But for the last 5 years, I'm staying here in Michigan because I'm born and raised in Michigan. This is where I'm going to stay. And you know, there were times I would feel so good. I could talk in front of 300 or 400 people at a time at U of M or Wayne State or Michigan State. And I know
you're not allowed to mention the competing schools here, but Ken.
Okay, well, it's
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding you.
You're going to strike that from the record. No, and you know, a lot of times, Marla, I'd get back home, I couldn't sleep all night because I was reliving everything that I was trying to put behind me. But I'm over that now, and I know I'm doing, you know, and I thought to myself, and this may sound like bullshit to you, but it's not. I was willing to pay that price. If I could save one life, I was willing to pay that price. And if you know, as attorneys, as you become attorneys and start practicing law, you have to take your, please, I beg you, take your job very, very seriously. Someone's life could be in the balance, you know, and make sure it's the right thing. You have to have the passion, the right thing to do. So please always remember my words about that. And I'll tell you what, I love talking to people. I love talking to students. If any of you ever want to give me a call or anything, or shoot me an email, get the info from Marla. I'll be more than happy to talk to you if I can help you in any way. But always remember, you have someone's life that is hanging in a balance. So just be your best. Be honest. Do your best. And don't take any bullshit from a crooked prosecutor or a cop.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for your time this evening. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions. know that maybe we can have another, certainly Ken might come into my class and talk to my students. I have some of my students here. You know, this is a very deep and wide topic. I hope that everybody will, I know Ken's doing his shameless promotion behind his back there on his book. He, you know, he collaborated on his book with one of his best friends from high school, which is sort of a little tidbit that's super neat. And honestly, there's never enough time for these topics, but you know, Ken, we just appreciate you.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. It's my honor. Believe me. And if I want to let you guys know about a couple of podcasts I just did in the last 2 weeks. Check them out. You can check them out on YouTube. The one I did last week with attorney Mike Morris. I don't know if you've seen his commercials on TV. Mike Morris, Kevin Dietz, who's a reporter from Channel 4 here in Detroit. Carl Marlinga and myself. The podcast was 2 hours. It is. You can watch it. It's on YouTube. Mike Morris, episode 45. Carl did such a great job explaining how the law works. He and I ripped Linda Davis a pretty good asshole because, you know, for what she did. So check that out. I did one yesterday, same group, Mike Morris, with one of the jurors at my trial actually wanted to come forward to tell what happened behind the scenes. That's going to be posted after 7 o'clock tonight. It's episode 46. But please check out the one with episode 45 with Carl and myself. Marla, did you watch the one I did with for the Young Turks with Sarah Dowland, the producer from Netflix?
I haven't watched that one yet because you told me it was 2 hours.
No, the one I did with Carl is 2 hours. The one
yes, I've seen the shorter one. Yes. Okay,
that was very informative too. But the one with Carl, you're going to get a kick out of, and you'll love. I finally get to tell my story where I told, you know, we were fighting so many years to get the wrongful compensation bill passed here in Michigan. It took us 13 years to get that bill passed, but then I finally got to tell my story. And Bill Schuette, who was then the Attorney General, he was one of the main roadblocks in getting that bill passed. But I finally got to tell my story where I met him in person. I told him to go fuck himself, and it's pardon my French, but that's a classic to me. And if I ever saw him again, I'd tell him the same thing. Believe me.
We probably should have advised people that this was PG-13 tonight. So my apologies to the host. But before I turn it back over to Professor Aiello, again, I want to thank you again. You're always a straight shooter. I typed my email address into the chat. So I'm also someone that you can reach out to if you want to learn more about Cooley Law School. I've been at Cooley now. I'm not going to say how many years. Only my hairdresser knows for sure.
I'll tell you. I'll tell you.
Ken, I'm going to mute you if I have to, you know. And you know, you can reach out to me to learn more about the Innocence Project or to learn more about the law school. And I think it probably would be best to reach out to me and I can put you in touch with Ken. But if you Google Ken, he's all over the place. He's doing a lot of work. The quarantine has probably made him just as prominent, if not more so. He's been doing a lot of this, and obviously he's getting a lot of attention. If you haven't watched episode 9, The $1 Million Man, you should definitely watch it. But again, I think from watching the episode and even the short time that we've had tonight, even the episode itself scratches the surface, guys. These are really, really challenging cases. And, you know, I'm just very proud to be part of the innocence movement and to, you know, I want to thank the law school because, you know, having a clinic in the law school, right, where we can not only do this really important work, but train lawyers. If you work on a case that assist someone who's innocent, even if you don't ultimately free them, but you actually believe that you worked on such a case, I can tell you that it is a very rewarding experience and a great learning experience. So thank you everyone for hosting us tonight. Frank, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Marla, if I can add one more thing. If I don't know if any of you have read my book. If not, if you want a copy, I'll be more than happy to sign a copy, and I'll send it to Marla. So give her that information. The book tells everything. Every word in that book has been proven true in the United States federal court. And God bless all of you. I'll keep you all in my prayers. And again, as I said, you contact me anytime if you want, if I can help you in any way.
Thank you so much, Ken. And thanks to everyone who participated. I also want to draw everybody's attention to one of our vice presidents, Paul Zielinski, who's in charge of admissions. If you have any questions about the admissions process as well, if you're still thinking about coming to Cooley, he'd be happy to chat with you about that. So thank you, everyone, and have a great night.